Before I get started, just a couple of thank yous. There have been a lot of thank yous, but I think one is to the society itself, which is being a Central Asia observer. I don't call myself a Central Asia specialist. I think of myself as an international affairs scholar who engages with Eurasia. I think a lot of people in this room have a lot more deeper expertise than I do, but just looking at the evolution of the field, the society is playing an extraordinary role, and its governance and its leadership all greatly improved over the last few years. And I think this project of trying to truly break down some of the national and disciplinary and even just logistical barriers that separate us is in very good hands. So I wish John all the best with that. I also have to pile on to the accolades to Marlene, and not just for the conference organization, not just because of what she's done here. She's just done remarkable things for our field in terms of connecting people, bringing into dialogue different kinds of concepts, different theories, different disciplines, different fields, and always in the most constructive and productive of spirits. GW and our field are much better off with her. And so, again, it's truly an honor. So, this is a challenge, right? What do I want to say? Maybe that I haven't said before. And so, really, of the last 2 years, I've started to reflect on my own book that I wrote. And I think some of the arguments in the book that I still would sort of strongly endorse, but I think more importantly, some ways in which I'd like to re-engage with the book, as opposed to just sort of give you a book overview. So what I'd like to do today is take on this this concept that's emerged out of Central Asian studies that I think has greatly influenced the study of international relations. Right? No one's really written on this, but I think I'm going to contest you a little bit, but I think this is something that's wide open to really show how multivectorism as a foreign policy doctrine, right, is a mode of operating. But to also show, perhaps ironically now, how Central Asian states are going to be increasingly challenged in pursuing multi-vector policies. And then in the last third of the presentation, after I had vowed never to do a Central Asian project again, I'm doing one now in collaboration with John Heathershaw, and so I want to actually open the conversation again. The title of the conversation is Locating Geopolitics, and it's very much referring to the two parts of the talk. The first part, looking at how geopolitics is conducted in a contemporary, I would argue, multipolar arena. What are some of the markers we should look for? And then reversing things in the end to think about how domestic politics should be regarded in a global era. So the themes of Great Games, Local Rules. I think the overall theme is that the Great Game analogy that was applied, especially after 9/11, to the region is deeply flawed. For many reasons, but primarily because past imperial competition obscures what I find to be very relevant and important for Central Asia, which is it's very much a contemporary window into what politics of a multipolar world looks like. It's a world in which US influence is there, but it's declining, and real separation, I would argue, between hard power and soft power. It's a world where China is rising, not just as an economic power, but as a public goods provider, building pipelines, issuing loans, development assistance. And it's a world in which Russia is leading the normative pushback against Western agendas on so-called values issues, human rights, democracy promotion, and so forth. So many, many themes that have emerged in other parts of the world, I would argue, since the mid-2000s, I think you see reflected very strongly in Central Asia. So the first couple of arguments of the book, the main ones, were that in this period, this intense period, 2001 to 2011, the US, China, and Russia all had actually different strategies, and their interactions differed. Sometimes they were competitive, sometimes they were emulative, sometimes one power mimicked the other, sometimes they collaborated, sometimes even on the same issue. And I go into that in the book. And then the second argument was that Central Asian states were not passive in this, right? They weren't acted upon, that they actively managed these interactions, sometimes actively managed perceptions of competition for their own internal benefits, domestic benefits, private benefits, both political and economic. So these two things coming together gives rise in the 2000s to this idea of great multivectorism as a driver in Central Asian policy. Almost axiomatic. It takes on different themes and different kinds of flavors, right? In Kazakhstan, it's about being center of Eurasia, a global power, multiple pipelines, multiple partners. In Uzbekistan, it accounts for these wild strategic shifts from US partner after 9/11 to then reluctant CSTO member to then withdrawing from the CSTO and once again partnering with the US and a general distrust of regional organizations, right? So while Kazakhstan is integrating in multiple levels into the international system, Uzbekistan is holding up, but both in a kind of multi-vector kind of way. Turkmenistan's this desperate quest for external energy partners, and in fact there you get the swapping of Gazprom, the Russian patron, with CNPC, the Chinese patron. In Tajikistan, it's this steady open door policy within Russian constraints. Like Russia is the primary partner, but then everyone else is welcome too. My point here is that there were actually a set of external conditions that made this so in 2001, 2011. The first was US and security partnership, post 9/11. That Central Asia became a site for military bases and logistic agreements, post-2008 for the Northern Distribution Network to supply troops in Afghanistan, related security assistance, which some would claim is quid pro quo for this access, train and equip programs, and then reverse transit plans that also gave rise to negotiations, also for quid pro quo. The second factor, I would say, the financial crisis. The financial crisis is what catapults China to the center of the scene, whether it likes it or not. Right, become center stage player economics. And I would say what was then a rather weak Russian strategy for engaging with the region, which I call unite and influence. And so for 10 years, these external forces were in relative equilibrium. They enabled multivectorism. They enabled Central Asian states all in their own ways to partner with the US, with China, with Russia, and maintain the balance. So let's just talk a little bit about the US, the security cooperation, military bases, the NDN. Prior to writing the book, there wasn't a good map out here. Is there just the key here? I guess it's okay. So we constructed one here. And the point being that for the Afghanistan campaign, the US and the West actually established a number of facilities both close to Afghanistan, but also in proximity to Russian military bases and military facilities. Whether you're looking at Kyrgyzstan, the Manas Transit Center, as it was known back then, next to Zircon Air Base, which was established 2 years later. Oh, sorry, thank you. The use of Dushanbe Airport by the French for staging flights, Kashi-Kanabad in southern Uzbekistan, from which the US was evicted in 2005, and then of course Termez, Uzbekistan, Germany's first overseas military base since World War II. Some interesting Soviet facilities in Mari and in Ashgabat too. The Northern Distribution Network. This is a remarkable logistical feat that was established by the US. So after supply lines were being hit in Pakistan 2006, 2007, the plan was to introduce supply over the Eurasian landmass. Right, and with branches set up over rail in the Baltic ports, NDN North coming in this way, NDN South, in the Black Sea by rail and over. And despite skepticism for people like myself, actually the supply was quite successful in its own terms. Let me give you an example of multivectorism in practice, and this is something written quite a bit about, but it's really Kyrgyzstan, and I would reprise Kyrgyzstan now as to how things are changing. But Kyrgyzstan became base central for about 10, 12 years. It hosted the Manas Transit Center, it hosted the Russian base at Khan. It was the center for transit in and out of Afghanistan and refueling, and it was also the Chinese entrepot for trade within Central Asia, right? So about 4 times Kyrgyz GDP used to come through Kyrgyzstan in trade because China would use Kyrgyzstan's WTO status and then re-export into the rest of CIS. So Kyrgyzstan's location made it a multi-vector hub, kind of real estate. Now, of course, the US ran into challenges, right? US policymakers viewed the base as a way to support operations in Afghanistan, almost very procedural, logistical. Kyrgyz media and opposition saw it as a symbol of US acquiescence to Kyrgyz presidents, their repression and cronyism, especially Akayev and Kiev, and the basis status itself was questioned by 2 regime changes following the political uprisings of 2005-2010. The base itself also became entangled in perceived US-Russian rivalry in the region, although again, there are some variations on this story. The peak politics of this kind of multivectorism was perhaps the base bidding war President Bakiev initiated in 2009. In that winter, on the wake of the great financial crisis, he agrees to close Manas in exchange for a 2.3 billion Russian aid and investment package. After he receives money, the first Russian tranche, he renegotiates with Americans what was the May 2009 agreement, the latest one. The air base is renamed the Manas Transit Center. The rent is increased from 17 million to 63 million. But Kiev has it both ways, right? He gets the Russian money, he gets the American money, and this is sort of the kind of typical perception of sort of dealing with both sides. The real controversy in Manas was, however, not the formal payments, it was the service contracts, right? And particularly fuel contracts totaling billions of dollars that were funneled to offshore entities with few corporate histories that had ties first to the Akayev regime and then an investigation into ties with the Bakievs. And that was where a lot of the controversy and a lot of the perceived entanglements that the US had in Kyrgyzstan was. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates came out with his memoir. He talked about Manas, which is great, so now you don't have to take my word for it. He referred to Manas as amazingly corrupt, as a site of grand extortion, and he said of Mr. Bakiev, he was without question the most unpleasant foreign leader I had to deal with in my years as Secretary. China. China's strategy grew out of also wanting to stabilize an adjacent region, but not Afghanistan, its western region of Xinjiang, right? Its Central Asian strategy was inside out almost, that wanting to connect Xinjiang to Central Asia, wanting to develop Xinjiang's neighbors, wanting to stabilize the border, wanting to secure Central Asian energy supplies, and all of this multilateralized its activities via the CESS. So China actually established an international regional organization to conduct these and to sort of put a multilateral face on it, something which causes researchers great confusion when they're trying to say, that's an SEO initiative. And you're like, really? Are you sure it's not a Chinese initiative? No, it's an SEO initiative. And then you sort of try and figure it out. Very confusing. But the main strategic driver remains Xinjiang. It's avoiding neighboring political stability or chaos. This is the way China looks at the Central Asia map. And it sees borders of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan in its most restive, sensitive province. When do Russia and China swap roles, so to speak, as the region's most important economic power? It is the financial crisis. This is total trade with the region, and in 2009 they swapped. Now they're both much higher than they were before, and actually Chinese trade is probably here, right? Because these are official trade statistics from the IMF. Customs officials chronically underreport trade with China, but China is really thrust into this leading role later. China also actually builds pipelines. We have a lot of pipeline conferences here in New York and Washington, D.C. All the great pipelines are going to be built. Well, China actually built 2 in this time period, natural gas pipeline, which now is also going to have a branch D, and the oil pipeline across Kazakhstan. And then Russia. What did Russia try and do in the 2000s? Well, a lot of Russian behavior was actually, I would argue, more socially driven than materially driven. It was driven by wanting to preserve its status as the region's primary power, right? And so this is what actually explains Russia taking sometimes very contradictory approaches to Central Asia. Following 9/11, President Putin calls President Bush. He's the first world leader to do so. He offers support, offers maps to Afghanistan, intelligence, agrees to, maybe it wasn't his choice to make, but certainly he agrees to the US basing presence in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Within 18 months, though, Russian perception of what the US is doing has changed, right? From conducting a war in Afghanistan, Russia now fears that the US is there to stay, that it's there to influence. The color revolutions come along, and there's a broad perception that the US really is engaged in also domestic political activity here. So Russia wants to lock in its influence. It starts to pioneer new types of security organizations, the CSTO, in the economy, the Eurosec, Customs Union, now the Eurasian Union. And I think most importantly, it wants to speak on behalf of the Central Asian states, right, in global fora in terms of formulating security policy and so forth. And again, when you look at the map from the Russian perspective in this kind of defensive competitive mode, right, you do see encirclement in Russia's sort of interest by the West, or at least Russian policymakers claim. So what changes? What changes? I would argue 2014. 2014, a aggregation of different geopolitical events that hit in 2014 start to alter geopolitical dynamics in the region, right? 2014 is itself, it's almost on its own, it's a meaningless concept, right? If you had told me 2012, well, what's going to be different in 2014? What would be different? Nothing. Yet something strange happened, right? With the perception of a looming withdrawal of the US in 2014, numerous governments, organizations, NGOs, companies in the private sector start taking stock. Well, what does this mean? What's the region going to look like? What's our strategy? Who are our competitors? What's China going to do? What's Russia going to do? What's the US going to do? It's actually remarkable to witness this in 2013, 2014, this moment of decision making and strategic reassessment. This is coupled with three actual geopolitical events. The first is the perception and anticipation of a changed security dynamic without the US, right? The US announces it's withdrawing in 2014, or will begin the drawdown. There is a link between the US announcing an East Asian rebalance, or the pivot to East Asia, and it withdrawing from Central Asia. This is why you start getting, for example, countries like the Balts complaining that they're being abandoned in Eurasia for the Philippines, kind of strange connections to be made. But you know what? When you're a world superpower and you announce that you're going to pivot somewhere, it means you're pivoting away from somewhere, right? And I think that was an unintended consequence. So the East Asian pivot is number 2. The Ukraine crisis is number 3, right? These three events together initiate a really calculated strategic readjustment for all actors. So where do we see multivectorism losing its spin? Again, this is not on the demand side. The Central Asian states want multiple partnerships, with, I would say, one exception at the moment. The US is perceived as retrenching. I know President Obama's speech got in the way this morning. But whatever the commitment, whatever the extension of the timeline, there is a perception that the US really isn't interested in Afghanistan. And if it's going to hold on, it's going to hold on, really to avoid things going to chaos, but it's not engaged in the deep sense that it was before. We now have a much more robust Chinese plan to march westward that I'll get into. And now I think we have a clear shift in Russian strategy that I would argue was a function of 2014 and also amplified by the Ukrainian crisis, which is going from having this soft sphere of influence to actually creating a network of client states, right? All this means that this multi-vector equilibrium is challenged. That states want multivectorism, but maintaining external balance is going to be increasingly difficult and challenging in this environment. So I'll just go through these quickly. I think the question, you'll have a US interest panel. What is the US interest in Central Asia? I think there's broad perceptions that the US doesn't have a great deal of interest anymore in Central Asia. Certainly on the security front, not the way it did. In terms of the Silk Route, right? We can promote the Silk Route, and that'll give us sort of an economic footprint in the region. Well, what we've seen is a lot of U.S. influence and U.S. policies haven't really translated into greater sort of economic activity and development. NDN was sort of mixed with plans for economic development. It actually didn't work that way. There was a conflation of rent seeking and transit fees with economic development. So actually NDN actually encouraged more sort of border controls in some ways. And really the Silk Route doesn't address what's, for me, is the #1 economic challenge in the region, the challenge of regional capital flight and kleptocracy, right? It's not so much a connectivity problem, it's that the money just doesn't stay in the region. What about political values? US much diminished in terms of its credibility as setting the agenda on values, on democracy and human rights. Ed Schatz's focus groups here on views about human rights and liberalism and democracy, I think, are very telling, that when the source of a positive statement of democracy and human rights is varied, and it comes from the US president or the US ambassador, supporting these focus groups goes way down. And I think captures somewhat what I think has been real damage to US as a values champion in the region, for a number of different reasons that I'm happy to get into in Q&A. Some of them the US's fault, some of them a function of the media environment, and some of them the function of political calculations. So what does this new Chinese policy look like? Well, some have quoted this new march westward, the Wang Jixi influential think tanker, as sort of driving this policy. Jixi's paper emphasizes that China needs to get out of this competitive box that the pivot is putting China in, this competitive relationship with the US. And actually, if it were to march westward and increase its engagement and its investment, that it could actually find areas of collaboration with the US. Interestingly enough, nowhere in the English translation anyway, does Jixi refer to Russia. He talks about West as this sort of unclaimed, open sort of area that China can collaborate with the US. Russia's never there in this sort of account. And then at Nazarbayev University in November 2013, the announcement by the Chinese premier of the One Route, One Belt initiative, an unprecedented initiative to connect Xinjiang to multiple outside routes, connect Europe and Asia and the Middle East via Central Asia. Also at the same time, last 2 years, a real increase in engagement of China with Afghanistan. Not troops on the ground, and they never will do that, but increased economic assistance and training, facilitating Afghanistan conflict mediation informally, and using Pakistan as its client intermediary to forge ties. So you also see Chinese reactions to perceptions of a US security vacuum. So OBOR itself is remarkable. It's comprised of a land belt, roads, rails, telecoms, pipelines, promises of hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, also a maritime belt with port upgrades, and an attempt to fill what McKinsey has called Asia's $8 trillion infrastructure gap. There's international and domestic imperatives. We talk a lot about the geopolitics, but actually the domestic imperatives are just as important. China is slowing down economically. Its industries are at overcapacity. Cement, steel, all need new outlets. And OBOR, just as I would argue the war on terror provided this umbrella for lots of domestic interests here to engage in contract and provide their services and so forth. I think OBOR will have a very similar function in China in that a lot of domestic interests will justify what they want to do in terms of this strategic initiative. South China Morning Post called this the most significant and far-reaching project the nation has ever put forward. Just in 2014, there was an announcement of 3 new regional funds devoted to this, right? This one's the People's Bank. This is actually quite interesting. The Silk Route Fund, dedicated to Central Asia and AFPAC, is actually controlled by the central bank in China, which also gets at some of these ideas that maybe it's more internal than external in some sort of Chinese thinking. Of course, the BRICS Bank, New Development Bank, and the AIIB. All the Central Asian states, except Kyrgyzstan, applied to join the AIIB. Right? And of course, we have the big policy back and forth here. The US encourages its allies not to join because the bank doesn't have standards. Its allies join anyway. I think it's poorly handled on Washington's part and actually diminishes its credibility and influence. But these vehicles are all now on the books. They're all there now ready to implement these hundreds of billions of dollars projects. So what's this meant to do? Here's one map, right, from Xinhua. I think what's important here in the land route, how central Central Asia is to these plans of connectivity. Also the maritime route there. And the central bank has, and actually the Wall Street Journal has done a really nice mock-up, including the energy pipelines that we saw earlier, and these proposed routes. And again, you see the hub going through Central Asia. I'm skeptical. Of course I'm skeptical. And I'm skeptical because Chinese assumptions about development very much mirror their assumptions about what's going to bring political stability in Xinjiang, right? This belief in infrastructure upgrades, modernization, right? And so the question becomes, as some of you have heard before, is development a hardware problem or a software problem, right? Are there actually reasons that we don't have better infrastructure in Central Asia already? And I ask everyone to do the following thought experiment. If the US were to announce tomorrow that we're going to pour in $47 billion to upgrade Pakistan's electricity generating plants and roads, how would you react? Would you say, wow, this is a game changer. The Americans are they're really serious about this. Or would you say, is Pakistan going to have the absorption capacity for this? Right? Is there really $47 billion worth of projects to go after? Yet when China announces it, right? There's this kind of broad sort of gasp, like China's remaking the map. Maybe they are. Maybe they are. But I think part of the problem that China is going to face, exactly because OBOR is driven by these domestic constituencies, is that a lot of these funds are going to run into some serious governance challenges. Just to make the case again, time required for import-export between 2006 and 2014, right? Central Asian import-export times are very, very high. They're the highest in the world, right? 104 days to import and export. Uzbekistan's improved somewhat on the export times, but everyone else, the changes have been minimal. Despite new Silk routes, despite NDN, despite Chinese initiatives and the SCO, despite Russian-led initiatives. In terms of formal trade, Central Asia really is the most trade-unfriendly place in the world, right? Here are the comparatives. Eastern Europe, Latin America, Caribbean, MENA, South Asia. This is Central Asia here. Notice Turkmenistan's not even in the data, right? So if you're going to build a new Silk route here, you're going to face real challenges. And I think the only point I would make is that, yes, there will be certain shipments that go through, right? There will be efficiencies. That Kazakh-Europe line will be used. The question is, what other kinds of micro-behaviors are they going to displace, right? I mean, I think that's the critical kind of issue. Let me talk about Russia. I know I'm in DC. Maybe this is heresy, I don't know. But I don't think Russia is resurrecting the Soviet Union. I think it's a dangerous way to think about Russian strategy. It conflates Russian aggression with nostalgia, a kind of myth-making. Confuses, I think, grand strategy with political opportunism. What I think is happening is that Russia is actually focusing its strategy to much better effective effect than it did before. Russia in the 2000s, as it re-engaged with Central Asia, and really the critical time here is 98, 99 under Putin. As it re-engages with Central Asia, it also is very careful to try and be everything to everyone, right? It wants all the Central Asian states to sign up to its regional organizations. It wants to mediate relations. It wants to have different fora. And there's a sense that the symbolism starts to trump the efficacy of some of these organizations, right? Note Uzbekistan's holdup of the CSTO's Rapid Reaction Force, right? CSTO can't do the Rapid Reaction Force because of Uzbek objections, right? But Russia doesn't want Uzbekistan to leave. It's important that symbolically it's there. Well, Uzbekistan leaves in 2012, and actually, some of these organizations start gaining a lot more coherence. What I see is that Russian strategy now, maybe out of weakness, maybe out of perceptions of US leaving, are starting to target a number of the smaller states in an effort to create formal political and economic alliance out of them, right? That Russia is looking at Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, I would argue, and Tajikistan, trying to deepen its control over them, trying to bring them in Russian-initiated economic and security organizations, trying to limit their outside options. And this is all in the context of trying to generate this regional opposition to Western counterparts and international rules. So I know this is deeply problematic in many ways, but I would actually argue low levels of Afghanistan's instability play into Russia's regional objectives, right? So it gives Russian bases in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan an actual operational purpose. Before in the 2000s, what does the 201st in Dushanbe do? You get different answers. What are you doing in Khan? Stability operations. But there's another base 70 kilometers to reduce stability of operations. There wasn't any kind of agreement on what those bases in Central Asia are doing. Now there is. Now they have strategic rationale, right? They are guarding against spillover, insecurity, instability from Afghanistan, or at least that's the claim. That's the justification for Russia pushing to get back on the Tajik border, right? To upgrade its presence, send helicopters and so forth. Actually, this also gives Russia a justification to increase border and security cooperation with the non-CSTO countries, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Again, playing the Afghan card. And always useful, criticize US-led interventions and regional consequences. See, the West went into Afghanistan, it broke it, it messed things up, now we have to clean up your mess. So, actually, this post-2014 environment works, I would say, pretty well with Russian objectives. I presented this when I was giving another talk in DC in June. This was Gallup data that was mashed up by RFE. Eurasian approval of Russian leadership. So we might think that post-Ukraine, there are concerns that the Central Asian states have, especially after comments made, especially about Kazakhstan not being a real state till Nazarbayev was there, that you might have a Ukraine crisis scenario in Central Asia, and the Central Asian states would want to tilt away from Russia, right? Also, the economic situation's a mess, right? Ruble is collapsing, migrant remittances are down in terms of the real value, the ones that can still get in. The counter-sanctions are also having an impact. Borders are going back up between Kazakhstan and Russia on some of this trade. So you might also think that's contributing to a negative perception of Russia. Maybe I did, and we would be 180% wrong. That approval for Russian leadership in Central Asia now is extraordinarily high. Yes, public opinion is always problematic. But let's look at the comps here, because I think they're compelling. 6% approval in Ukraine, 7 in Poland, 8 in Kosovo, 11 in Germany. All that sounds right to me. Georgia, 16. Tajikistan, 93. Kyrgyzstan, 79. Kazakhstan, 72. Armenia, 66. Even Uzbekistan, 62. What is going on? What is going on? This is flummoxing, I think, some Western policy officials. I would say there are 3 kind of factors here. One, the Russian media space is very effective portraying the Ukraine crisis. That actually, there are 2 different lessons to be drawn from the Ukraine crisis. One is a fear of Russian intervention, right, and violation of sovereignty, but the other is a fear of Maidan. It's a fear of street protests, right, and that's equally important. That's something we don't give enough attention about. The so-called color revolution problem, right? And then I think a genuine belief at the end of the day, in both economic issues and security issues, Russia will provide the stabilizing role. Right? That's the deeply ingrained narrative. So perhaps over the long term, Russia's influence declines, and I think sort of structurally it does head that way. Central Asia does go further east. But in the short term, we have to realize that this aggregation of effects in 2014 is actually making Central Asians hungry for more Russian leadership, not less. And again, I put this slide in here. Post-Ukraine 2014, if you're a Central Asian ruler, which do you fear more? Do you fear Russia coming in and amputating something? Or do you fear a Maidan? Or maybe the 2 are linked. If there is a Maidan, the Russians will come in and amputate something. And for sure, if you're sitting in Dushanbe, I think that Russian military presence looks a lot different now than it did before 2014. I come back to Kyrgyzstan. David Lewis has a superb paper on this called Performing Hegemony, where we've gone from being this multi-vector hub to really performing its new status as a Russian client state. And Marlene and I got at this in a memo we wrote for Pronars a couple of years ago, but across all dimensions, the military dimension, Russia pressuring Kyrgyzstan to not renew for another year to facilitate the US drawdown, the consolidation of military facilities, the introduction of copycat legislation, anti-LGBT laws, the foreign agents laws, the purchase of Kyrgyz gas by Gazprom for $1, assuming all of that debt, all that burden. Why would you want to purchase an asset? Well, for political reasons, right? Investment in Kamarata, and so forth and so forth. There is almost a sense, and Lewis makes this point, that both sides are very eager to demonstrate sort of the classic nature of a political client relationship. So what does all this mean? Does this mean that the kind of argument that I made in Great Games is actually falling apart? I hope not. But I think we need to reflect on it. And the way I would, or I'm thinking about it, is that it's not so much that multivectorism is no longer appreciated. It's that I actually think the geopolitical challenge of the Central Asian states is going to be to try and be multi-vector and to try and gain options to diversify away from what's mounting Russian and Chinese engagement, some would call hierarchy in the region. Right? And I think that's the challenge. Where does that third vector come from? If it's not the US, I think the EU brings up all sorts of challenges that we can talk about. Some have argued maybe it's East Asia, but that's the challenge that the Central Asian states find themselves in. My last 5-10 minutes here, and I apologize for going over, I want to come back to the next project. And the next project is really the inverse of the first project. That I think through this period of geopolitical intrigue, on the comparative politics front, things have been relatively static. Now, I think there's some tremendous books out there on Central Asian authoritarianism, patrimonialism, Ed's work on these systems, the great work by Larry Markowitz on the lootability and the movability of resources and the patronage networks that creates for security services. Eric McGlinchey's book on patronage systems and authoritarianism. Jones and Long on the resource curse in this area. All these are really great work. But I think there's also a sense in which we've neglected the global context of where these trends in Central Asian politics are taking place, right? When we say that there's no alternative to President X in country X or country Y, is it there's no alternative in the country? Or might there have been alternatives and those alternatives are no longer residing in the country or even in the region? What we start to get is a sense that Central Asian political opposition, political contestation, legal maneuvering is increasingly taking place in places like London, in Paris, even in the States, more so and more robustly so than the region itself. So together with John Heathershaw now we're exploring this in a new book for Yale University Press. And we start off our argument, and this was also covered in the offshore Central Asia issue, as we really want to tackle 3 myths of Central Asian domestic politics, right? First is this myth of global isolation related to lack of connectivity, right? This idea that Central Asia is isolated, right? It's over there. They need to be integrated in the international system. There's immense integration, we'd like to show. Not only through labor markets, not only through international finance, but a whole cadre of interlocutors, brokers, lawyers, accountants, go-betweens who facilitate these forms of international integration. Perhaps not the ones we'd like to see, but certainly there. There's a myth of partial or incomplete economic liberalization, the failed liberalization in the region. We don't see it that way. We see countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan as having liberalized extensively. In fact, that's why in a place like Tajikistan, you have 65% of GDP capital flight the last 2 years, right? Just a massively disturbing statistic, right? To get capital out, you need to be liberalized. Or how about the story of Asia Universal Bank in Kyrgyzstan that turned into, according to Global Witness, a money laundry for a number of correspondent accounts all over the world. Trillions of dollars funneled in through AUB, all with a board that consisted of a number of key Western representatives. So we don't think this is about the failure of liberalization. This is actually liberalization running amok in a place that did not have the same regulatory apparatus and external kinds of pulls as Eastern Europe did. And then I think there's the myth of traditionalism. I'm not going to replay the clan debate, right? Central Asian clan dynamics and so forth. I think it's a very interesting debate, and some of you here in the audience have contributed to that. I think my take on it is this myth of sort of traditionalism is nested in these global dynamics, right? That these Central Asian elites are as much global citizens as they are local citizens, right? They have residencies in our world capitals as much as they do in their particular region, and they behave accordingly. So this opens us, I would argue, to a much richer, much more dynamic, much more interactive understanding of how political competition and contestation happens in Central Asia. Yes, there is what happens in the region, in Kazakhstan itself, in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and these are all important trends, looking at formal party formation, political competition, if and where it exists, elections, and so forth. But much more important is the interaction between the two. Let me give you some examples before I conclude. This gentleman, case of Mukhtar Ablyazov, one of our cases. Two completely different narratives regarding Ablyazov and who he is. To the Kazakh government, he is at the center of a massive BTA bank fraud, allegations of embezzling billions and billions of dollars, possibly up to $10 billion, the biggest financial scandal of the year. And having looked at a lot of these arbitration transcripts, I'm inclined to think Mr. Ablyazov probably did embezzle a lot of money. What's undisputable is that he's been found in contempt by the UK High Court for failing to disclose his assets, right, as part of a summary sort of court judgment. That's one narrative, right? And so Kazakhstan is now using all of its legal means to try and bring Mr. Ablyazov back to justice. Then there's the counter-narrative. The counter-narrative is that Mr. Ablyazov is a democratic champion. While he was in exile, he allegedly supported opposition media and party organizations, that he was intimately involved in orchestrating political developments in Kazakhstan. These are two very different narratives, but I think they also show the real external-internal tension that's going on here. I am actually even perfectly willing to accept that Mr. Ablyazov did all of these things. What makes me curious as a scholar is why the Kazakh government would marshal so many resources from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to make Ablyazov's criminal case a foreign policy issue. Right? That to me is analytically really interesting. Right? So prior to 2013, there have been 3 powers in the world that had engaged in extraordinary renditions to Central Asia. The US and the CIA from 2001 to 2004, Russia and China had all rendered and cooperated Central Asian security services. 2013, we added Italy to the list, right? When Italian authorities cooperated with Kazakh officials and diplomats to send Ablyazov's wife and daughter back to Kazakhstan, and the UN said this was an extraordinary rendition, they were returned, and so forth. So to me, the politics surrounding what's internal, what's external, right? What's legitimate foreign policy conduct, what's criminal conduct, what should be the tools? This is all very interesting, very fertile, and I think provides some very difficult questions for us researchers to consider. Perhaps you're more familiar with this case. This is President Karimov's daughter, one of his daughters, Lamar Karimova, who has been recently implicated in a series of telecom scandals and related investigations regarding bribes, especially in the Tele-Sonara case, but also MTS. What's fascinating here is the potential, because it's all circumstantial, but the potential, again, external-internal linkage, right? That as the scandal breaks, as it spread, we have subject to money laundering probes in the US now, Switzerland, France, and Sweden. She is recalled from her post as ambassador to Spain. She goes back to Tashkent, she's placed under house arrest, and supposedly is now involved in an internal struggle with the head of National Security Services. And at some point, she's then appealing, supposedly in social media, to Western media as a human rights defender and champion. Now, I think the counterfactual to ask ourselves, if we could find it out, because it's so difficult to do research in Uzbekistan, would this have happened if we hadn't had these external money laundering probes launched? I think it's a legitimate question to think about. But again, I think it points to potentially this global, local, power political dimension. Central Asian politics goes offshore. Talco, responsible for over half of Tajikistan's export earnings. Tajikistan Aluminum Company. Actually, it's managing operational core is registered here in the British Virgin Islands, right? And has been the subject of great criticism from the IMF and World Bank for not being transparent in terms of what happens in its books, how many people it actually employs, and so forth. What's interesting about Talco is that this particular company has also been the subject of one of the most expensive legal cases in UK court history. Nearly £100 million in legal fees expended between former managers of Talco and current ones. Eventually they settled after sort of 3-year litigation. But the battle for Talco was actually fought in London. And now I'm wrapping up. I think the final kind of analytical question I ask myself is, what then is the nature of Central Asian civil society? Where is its strength? Where is its networks? And traditionally, we, following Keck and Sikkink, we think of sort of NGOs as being driven by principles, commitments to liberal values, that they connect with their counterparts in the West, with friendly governments, with IOs. They boomerang around, they put pressure on governments. Those aren't the trends I'm seeing. The trends I'm seeing in the region is that civil society is extraordinarily weak, it's becoming weaker. It's being cracked down upon, it's being repressed, you have this copycat legislation. Even a place like Kyrgyzstan, yes, there is civil society in Kyrgyzstan, but it is increasingly under assault. Whether it's going to survive another 5 years, I don't know in any meaningful way. And you've seen similar anti-NGO bills introduced in every Central Asian country. Where I would argue you have many more robust transnational ties are at the level of Central Asian elites themselves. Actually, you want robust transnational civil society? Look at Central Asian elites. Look at Lola Karimova, involved in international charity, a diplomat to the UNESCO. This is a 2000 gala. She's here with a famous French actor at her charity launch in Paris. Right? These are the robust networks that they've immersed themselves in. So, borrowing from sort of Steve Kotkin's term that he used to explain sort of dissidents in the Soviet Union, I think we need to ask ourselves, these global connections, who are they empowering? On what terms? Who are they supporting? So just to conclude, I think Central Asian politics is constantly in a process of flux and of being relocated. Relocated geographically, relocated conceptually. And on the one hand, I think it provides a wonderful laboratory to look at sort of multipolar politics in a setting. But I also think that the kind of era of obvious multivectorism might be declining. But I think the reverse now is also a very exciting research agenda, right? The idea that Central Asian domestic politics are not isolated, that it's increasingly implicating global networks, institutions, and social sectors, and that perhaps we just haven't been looking in many of the right places. So I'm going to leave it at that, but before I do, just one final kind of plea to the audience, and especially to the younger Central Asian scholars who are here. In some ways I shouldn't be giving this keynote here, right? So my thoughts about the region. And it's my hope that, and seeing the quality of scholarship now coming out is tremendous. I want to encourage all of you to not only pursue your own research projects and apply them to the disciplines, but to take on the disciplines, right? There's nothing sacred about political science and these international, domestic kinds of comparison. Apply, but also push the boundaries, reformulate, reconceptualize. I think the field really needs you, and it needs you to re-engage anew with some of these very basic concepts that we in the West, they serve some purposes, but also we start to take for granted, and I think we need to be shaken up as well. So with that, I'll conclude. I apologize for going over time. Very happy to take any questions or criticisms you might have.